It is so great to be with you today. Thanks for having us and inviting us in to be a part of this incredible series and the conversations that you guys have been having these last few weeks. We're excited to be with you today.
Yes, it is a joy. It is a joy to be with you and to just meet you where you are in this series, especially you mamas that are out there today. I know that there has been a lot that you've been carrying, and we've all been carrying for the last couple of years. And the fact that you're leaning into this conversation and this topic about the overwhelm, the burnout, this is real. So we're ready we're ready to just go deep real quick.
So I'm going to ask Rebekah several questions. She's the subject matter expert here today on helping us work through the rhythms we've employed in our own life, in our own family, but also really in building resilience and understanding what does it look like for us to not have seasons where we completely spin out, but we learn from those seasons and we start to build into something that really brings life. And so I know many of you have experienced a lot of overwhelm. I know for us with 4 children, we have 2 special needs children. One's 22, one's 10 years old. And then we have 2 children that are going into college. And so we know what it's like to try to balance a lot of things, to feel responsibility. But there are those moments, Rebekah, where overwhelm does set in and you can start to just feel the weight of the world on your shoulders. Maybe share a little bit about how you've experienced some of that overwhelm and the ways in which you've tried to approach that.
Yeah, so I learned the hard way that burnout is when you try to give from an empty place. And I think a lot of us really begin the things that we're called to and passionate about with so much zeal and so much energy. And I know for me, first as a mom, full-time home for over 10 years until my youngest went off to kindergarten, and then trying to reawaken to who was Rebekah before that. And that kind of yielded even this mental health journey where God rescued me even out of panic disorder, but then starting to write about that and travel about that and be really passionate about that. And then 2020 came and then 21 came. And honestly, I was burned out. I mean, I saw symptoms of burnout, and I remember our mentor, Pete, told us that when you start to see symptoms of burnout, you better pay attention, because if you truly, fully experience burnout, you might not return to that line of work. And that was very sobering for both of us.
Yeah, because you don't want that fire to go out because you won't return to that line of work. You end up, many of the things I believe God has for each of us can fall by the wayside because we didn't know how to take care of ourselves. Yes. We didn't know how to practice a lot of these rhythms that help us stay in a place where we feel rested and we feel restored and we have the energy out of that to go live into everything that God's put in front of us, whether it's the people around us that He's called us to care for or to shepherd, like our families or our friends or our community, or also the things He's called us to create with our hands.
Yeah. And so I would say the last couple of years, I was there. I saw the symptoms of burnout kind of when the world went home, like we all went home with you. And I started to spin out because I realized that I kind of managed that burnout with coping and just staying busy. But honestly, my heart was not in it. I remember telling the Lord, I think we're done with writing. I think we're done with books. I mean, here am I like telling God what we're doing. But I truly did not have the engine, the gas in the tank to keep going. And I write about it in this new book, Building a Resilient Life, that there was a moment where there was a fine line where my work became my worth. And then you have a decade of sleepless nights and this chronic need to go and the pressure to perform and produce. And then you forget why you began in the first place. Yeah. And God used these last couple of years to fortify my faith, to really give us both rest as a couple, to explore the places of marriage that we really could kind of dust under the rug and in the name of ministry and mission and keep going. But that halt, that screeching halt for all of us, and I think for society at large, really was this moment to put a mirror up and go, God, what am I missing? Am I doing this out of my own strength? And so that's when He whispered this idea that adversity awakens. And that's truly the kind of the point of the book, is that adversity, the hardness, even the things that are pushing us to the brink, are the things that God wants to use to awaken strength and hope and meaning.
Yes, we want to explore with you this morning, what does it look like for us to be resilient people who go through these difficult seasons, reevaluate what matters, and then decide we're going to restructure life in such a way that it's going to lead to more life, not just for myself, but in my marriage or in my friendships or with my children. And so, Rebekah, I know one of the things as you were working through this idea of resilience became something that was just so animated to you because, and I'll tell you, you have a unique way of thinking about resilience that I would say is counterintuitive, a little countercultural even, to how most of us have heard the word resilience. And probably what's immediately coming to mind right now when you hear me say, we need to be resilient, you're probably thinking one thing, and I'll bet Rebekah might shift the way you're thinking about it with how she would define it.
Well, I started to study. I'm kind of I like to nerd out on brain books and science and faith. I always believe that the Lord is the master scientist that made our brains, and He wants us to think health. He doesn't want us to walk in depression or anxiety or panic or anything or even disordered thinking or intrusive thoughts. Like that is not of God. And so it's coming back to Scripture and go, okay, this idea of resilience. I was doing a mental health summit, and I wanted to write this book for our kids and raise the next gen to be ones who could embrace adversity so that they could be strong. And then I realized, quickly that this is not just for our kids. It was for all of us. And we all need it. And so I went back to Scripture, and I wanted to know what God had to say about hardship, about trouble, about adversity, because we can't begin to build a resilient life if we don't understand what's coming against us and what our posture of response must be. So I want to reference that real quick. In 2 Corinthians 4, it says here in verse 7, this treasure of clay jars, it says, "Now we have this treasure in clay jars, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us. We are afflicted in every way, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but we are not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry the death of Jesus in our body, so that the life of Jesus may be also displayed in our body." And it jumps to verse 13. "And since we have the same spirit of faith, keeping with what is written, we speak." It says, "I believed, and therefore I spoke. And so therefore we believe and speak." Verse 16, "So therefore we do not give up. Even though our outer person is being destroyed, our inner person is being renewed by the day." Renewed means to make new again and again and again. Renewed day by day. "For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable, eternal weight of glory." So we don't focus on what is seen, maybe the things that are hard right in front of us, but we focus our eyes on Christ, the unseen. "For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." And I realized that my burnout and my overwhelm was very much focused on what was right in front of me that became a really big deal, like crisis management of laundry and junk and cleaning out the fridge. And I don't know about you guys, but when we all went home, I just needed a new thing to stress about. And so I was not a fun person to be around, in those early days of lockdown. And it's just, I realized I just needed to control something because I was really trying to manage a fear of the unknown. But God was going, "Hey, I'm doing a bigger thing here. There's something that you're going to need to surrender." And so He showed me as I began to study with resilience that I just love to describe it a little bit. I describe it in the book, but it says here that popular culture wants to limit the definition of resilience, using it to describe people who bounce back. And while I appreciate this, I see the term a bit broader. Bouncing back implies that resilience is something simple and quick, such as the return of a ball bounced against a wall time and time again. That we, people who are burned out, could simply be tossed and retrieved without eventually becoming cracked or deflated. Wouldn't it be nice if that were true? But we are not people who simply bounce back. We experience all kinds of trouble. We endure unspeakable tragedy and ambiguous loss, some of which takes a lifetime to heal. We develop wounds and scars, and resilient people experience this pain with honesty and bravery, and they become stronger not despite the resistance, but because of the resistance. So I would like to define resilience this way. It's our daily consecrated act of remembering right here in 2 Corinthians 4 that there's something far greater than our present troubles, which offers us the power to endure and emerge. And in adversity, what is the something greater we're supposed to remember? Well, the words of Jesus. He says, in this world, you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. Jesus didn't promise easy existence. He didn't promise health or wealth or prosperity, or he promised, hardship and difficulty, but he also gave us a greater promise that he would endure all of this on our behalf and that with him we would overcome. And so this is a holy resilience. It's a different way of going. This isn't a humanistic version of going like, I'm just going to will my way into bouncing back and with this brute force and strength and obstinance. It's going, no, I'm going to bend low. I'm going to be willing to be pressed and crushed in places that I didn't ask for. But I'm also going to let the light of Christ shine in me in such a way that will bring new life, new resurrection power. And as a result of just surrendering to it, like our journey in that season, our oldest son, Cade, with Down syndrome, was having the hardest year of his life. He's largely nonverbal. He had a brand new sister that joined our family from China when we adopted her a couple years prior. He was pulled out of school and his support social system. He didn't have a place to say what so many of us were feeling, and so it went inward, and he began to kind of bang his head and hit it against the wall and just despair in his little body. And we as parents did not know how to meet him there. And I remember one day going on a walk in the woods and I said, God, are you going to lift this? Lift this for Cade. It felt like he was spiraling and we were all grieving with him privately, not in public, and didn't know how to be what we needed to be as his parents. And I said, are you going to lift this? And God said, not yet. But I'll be here for as many wailing walks as you need. And the promise of his witness and his nearness all of a sudden shifted my view of what Cade was going through and what we were going through. And I said, okay, God, you've got this. We might be pressed and crushed in this moment, but we're not going to be despaired because you've overcome the world. So show us how to walk this out. And remarkably so, we got therapy as a family counseling. We've got a lot of people that were coming around us to help meet Cade's needs. And honestly, he's a different kid today than he was a couple years ago. And had God just said quickly like, oh yeah, it's going to be solved tomorrow, you'll be fine, I might not have depended on God with the level of intensity that I did during that season. I might not have grown in the way that I needed to grow in strength and in hope. And then I definitely wouldn't have the meaning attached to this that I can now look at other people on the other side of the room and say, hey, you're not alone and this is not the end of your story. And so part of this building a resilient life and these 5 rules are so much about leaning into God, the author and finisher of our faith, and letting him be the one who guides us through something that says, though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you will fear no evil, he is with you. And then eventually that darkness lifts, and we're living to tell that story today.
Yeah, so Rebekah just mentioned it, but there's 5 rules that are practical that each of us can start to employ in our life that will help us build a resilient life. A resilient life doesn't just happen. It comes through actually some real intention and looking at some of these areas of our life that maybe we were scared to look at. We weren't sure how to voice it or give language to some of the things that we're feeling. And so we're going to walk through each of those and just give you a brief understanding of maybe each of these rules so that you can evaluate, am I practicing that? And if I'm not, how might I? And so the first rule, Rebekah, is to name the pain.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that. You named the pain with Cade on that walk in the woods,
yes.
right? You were getting very clear about this is a pain I'm feeling.
Yes.
But describe a little more what that might mean for people who don't know how to feel their pain, much less name it.
Well, I think what happens is those of you who are overwhelmed or burned out, it's partly you are empty because there's not been a replenishment, right? Maybe you've just been serving and giving and giving and giving, and you almost don't even have words for the level of exhaustion or discouragement or defeat that you're feeling. And so I found that when I got real loud and honest with God, I was better suited and able to get real, not quite as loud and honest with Gabe. And what I realized that even in our marriage, we were kind of facing the confusion and the sadness of Cade separately. Like we were almost arguing on how to better parent Cade because we just were so at a loss on how to be what he needed. And all we had to do was just name the pain to one another. And so in that chapter, I talk about like how you cannot heal what is hidden. Like Gabe can't read my mind. I can't read his mind. It's going to take real vulnerability before God first, but then to one another to go, hey, Gabe, and there was a moment where I just was at the end of myself and I just said, I'm broken. I don't know what to give him. I don't know how to be the best mother and the best wife. And then I said the worst. I said, and I'm afraid that I'll never change, that shame will bury me so much that I won't have actually the tools to heal. And you and and God used Gabe in his response to me in that moment. He said, we're all broken. You're just more aware of it.
Yes.
Which honestly, like, let the air out of the balloon. You guys don't understand. Like, I didn't realize that I had retreated from you and from the kids when I would always feel like I was failing. I would hide. I would go in my closet. I would have an ugly cry, and then I'd come back out and then keep going. But I was training my brain to say that anytime things are hard, you're going to be alone in this, and you need to go hide and isolate and self-protect. When in fact, it was the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, part of naming the pain can be difficult, especially if you didn't grow up in a household where talking about your emotions was something that was practiced or encouraged. I know in my own life, it was one of those things where emotions, crying, those types of things weren't something that was celebrated. It was looked upon as weakness. I know in my own journey, I've had experience now with a counselor, and that was a big step for me 5 years ago to start working through some of my own pain. I thought I didn't have a lot of pain. And what it really...
You just wasn't aware of it yet.
Yeah, what it meant was I'd really covered up really well a lot of pain and started to create my own coping mechanisms, whether that would be work or whether it would be just distractions of recreation or golf or entertainment, whatever it might be. I was always finding different ways to stay busy, to stay what felt like happy. And then I realized through the process of naming the pain and having the help of a counselor, it helped me unpack some things from my earliest days forward as to the story God was telling through me. And it wasn't that those painful moments of my past were just there and we needed to just look back and I was a victim. It was no, these were parts of the story that God was going to unfold through redeeming lots of that pain and helping you better walk into his purpose and calling. So I'd say to encourage even you men out there who maybe counseling's not been something you've done, don't be afraid of it. It's easy to be intimidated by it. But Rebekah was very patient. Yeah. Many times our wives understand more what they're feeling quickly. I've found that to be true, not for every man, but for a lot of men. They have a challenge sometimes of connecting head and heart, maybe not as much as women might. And so I think I would encourage you, like, just keep exploring it. Have conversations with your wife. Try to work through what are some of the areas I'm feeling some pain in, and don't be ashamed of that pain. Be willing to confess it, to talk about it, and that'll help initiate a great conversation.
Yeah, Gabe would always joke, like, I feel like Rebekah's assessed her pain and my pain. Like,
right.
And that's a little intimidating. But you found your words, you found your voice, and it really, God uses that. Scripture says, confess your sins to God and one another so that you can be healed. And it wasn't so much this like intentional sin against one another. It was more like the pain that we had agreed with, that we had buried, that we had bought the lie of. That's what I had to...
Yeah, that it'll never change.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I had to confess, that I've given up, that I am not doing the next rule, which is shifting the narrative. So when I named the pain, all of a sudden I was like, wow, I don't really believe that I'm beyond repair. But that's what I was believing inside. But saying it out loud and naming it, all of a sudden I was like, and then being met with the grace of that, going, okay, rule 2, shift the narrative now. Yeah. I no longer agree with that statement.
Yeah, and part of shifting the narrative then is not becoming a victim to circumstances or to your past story, but it's recognizing that you can retrain your brain. I mean, this is the amazing thing about our brains, about neuroscience, is the recognition that our brains can continue to be formed and shaped.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So in the last 20 years, in particular, in neuroplasticity, basically says and tells us that we can repair injured neurons in our brain from trauma. And trauma can be anything from obviously an acute incident to just a chronic trauma of neglect or what might feel like emotional abandonment. It doesn't have to be an extreme situation, but because it's consistent, it really does kind of become the way we see ourselves. It becomes the way we see God and one another. And so shifting the narrative, I somehow along the way as a kid bought the lie that I'm not worthy of love unless I earn it. And I think that just became because I was a firstborn, type A, control freak. I don't know if any of you in the room can resonate with this, but I was this performer who would perform for love because that was when I was affirmed. That was when I was shown love, right? I don't know. It wasn't a conscious thing that my parents were trying to do to kind of like, you're only worthy of it. But somehow that's how I translated it. And that just kind of moved into my work and moved into my marriage and moved to my motherhood. And just by going, okay, Gabe, now I'm inviting you into this deepest part of my heart that I didn't even know I had words for. You're able to give me words to the deepest places of your heart. And now together, we're starting to shift the narrative of how we see ourselves, how we see one another, and how we want to actually change how we see our kids and let them grow up in a place that isn't contingent on what you do or what you accomplish or what milestones you meet, so that you feel like you're worthy. Yeah. So that was a big piece of shifting the narrative for us.
Because lots of times the pain keeps you captive to something, to a narrative that you've bought into your mind that things will never change. And that does lead to despair. And there's a lot of people in our world today feeling that sense of despair. Things will never change. But when you start to shift the narrative, you start to believe, no, there's a hopeful future. God has a future for me, and the truth actually sets me free to experience it. And so when we start to live that out, we start to adjust the way that we're seeing our circumstances. We start to shift the way we're viewing adversity as it comes to us, which leads us to rule number 3, which is to embrace adversity. And I would say this is really the crux of the message, is a shift in how we think about challenges that are coming our way.
You're right. I mean, this was a pivotal game changer, right? When you have named something and you now change the way you think about it, then you're retraining your brain. And this is the offense. You're no longer in the defense. You're like on the offense. And there's a chapter in that section called Anxiety is My Friend. It was the friend that taught me resilience, quite frankly. And for a decade, I would run from any claustrophobic anything, right? So my panic disorder was rooted in claustrophobia. And so we had lived in New York during that season, and you're surrounded by planes, trains, elevators, subways, and crowds. And every time I would step into those places, my brain would say, you're not safe. You need to quickly retreat from this place, or you'll be trapped and powerless. And that was terrifying to me in ways I couldn't quite fully understand. Well, God pulled me out of that through his peace and his mercy back in 2011, but it still took a lot of vigilance, a lot of repetitive acts of retraining my brain over the years through the Rhythms book, through this resilience rule, because that's how you heal those injured neurons. And the thing is, one thing for you to heal, it's when your kids start to struggle with this. And so there's a chapter in here about Kennedy. So there's a CDC study that came out this spring that teen girls are the ones that are struggling so much with depression, anxiety than any other generation, honestly, since we've been alive. And my daughter, Kennedy, experienced this in middle school. And I was like, great, here we are. I'm trying to help her walk through the things I'm just fresh walking through. But one thing we've watched Kennedy do is she really doubled down. I mean, she is a bit of a fighter. I've met my match with her, which the enemy is like, I'm not sure how I feel about this, because whatever he would throw at her, she would just turn it on its head. And it's been sweet to watch her from age 13 to now 18 just confront. And the biggest tool of this embracing adversity is that when you turn toward the pain and you just literally go, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to believe this lie. I'm going to reject and renounce this spirit of death or something that's trying to just tell me that I need to curl up in a ball and cry. But with Christ, I'm just going to confront this. I'm just going to confront this. And so what that looked like for Kennedy is scripture, discipleship, study, leaning into how to be armored with the full armor of God before the pressure comes, right? Before you're in the middle of it, and retraining that brain in advance so that when it comes, you're prepared for that.
And when you embrace adversity, I mean, we're used to it in the gym. You train with resistance. Like, we do things to strengthen ourselves, but sometimes when it comes to this space of feeling overwhelmed or anxious, we just want to run from it. But the neuroscience is showing that when we don't run from it and we actually walk through it, then we build a strength. We train our brain to see the adversity not as something to fear, but as something we can overcome.
Right.
And as you said, it can become our friend. I'd like you to take a second and speak to the women in the room who maybe are feeling the anxiety of this season with their children, and knowing these teenagers are feeling so much anxiety. You shared how we've walked through that with our children. How would you encourage the mothers in the room who are feeling just the weight of the world as it relates to their children, their own mental health? How would you encourage them?
Yeah, I would just say there were so many days, and still sometimes this happens, where I feel so ill-equipped. Like, God, I think you got the wrong girl. Like, I don't know how to do this well. I don't know how to mother these kids well. I feel like I struggle. And I just want you to know that before you were born, God actually called out your whole entire life, and He gave you the gifts to live those days out. And He's given you everything you need. And part of it is, I think, for all of us just to believe that He wouldn't entrust you with these amazing kids if He wasn't going to be right there with you through every step of the way. And so I have found that on the days I feel extremely ill-equipped and I don't know what to say, and I'm like, I'm just more desperate in my prayers, let's be honest. I don't feel like I have everything I need, but I go, God, you do. And I can lean into the source of life and truth, and you're going to give me the words to say. And so I walk into every day now, God, give me the words to say, to speak life over my kids, to call out their destiny in the way you have for me, to tell them what they're good at, to celebrate what I see in them, to cling to what is good, it says in Ephesians 4, to just actually honor and steward the mouth, right? Like, may our lips agree with what God says is true. It's when I start disagreeing with my lips what God says in His Word about my kids that it starts to derail. But if all I need to do is agree with what God says about my kids, then I'm just going to be that voice of encouragement. Even on the days where I'm like mustering it up, I know that God has He's got my back, and He's going to give you everything that you need in those moments. But you will have to steal away and kind of in that secret place go, God, give me exactly what I need to be the best mom for them, to believe for them and with them and whatever they're walking through.
Yeah, so as you're building this resilient life, you've dealt with the pain, you've shifted the narrative, you've taken a different approach, maybe an attitude to embracing adversity. The final two rules really help launch us into this resilient life and how we think every day, the types of things that animate our life. The fourth rule is to make meaning.
Yes.
Talk about the value of purpose and meaning making in our life.
Well, the reason that follows adversity is because, honestly, everything hard that I've ever walked through has been the fruit later in my life in the ways that I have found meaning, right? So, like, whatever hardship or trial you've endured directly relates to the measure of hope that you offer the world. And Kennedy's seen this now. She's talking to teen girls all the time, whether it's on Reels online or she's discipling people in person. But she's like, oh, I've actually walked through that, and here's where the Lord met me, and here's what it took. This is where I had to get to for God to actually give me a revived heart, or give me a freedom, or give me a new perspective. I think of my own life, I didn't pick to be anxiety girl or special needs mom, but that was God's perfect plan for my life so that His glory may be on full display. And all of a sudden there's so much meaning attached to the adversity, if that makes sense. Yeah. You know, like the root word of passion means to suffer. And we all are suffering. Let's be quite honest. We have suffered a lot in these last couple of years, and we just want to run from the pain, and we want to just like dust it on the rug and avoid it. And yet when you avoid fear, it grows. When you avoid pain, it is not going anywhere. God's going, I'm letting you see this so that you can deal with it directly. With my help, you can find freedom and release and rescue. And then on the other side of that, there's a whole lot of meaning attached to walking through something hard. Because God's going to give you a story that you can't shut up about, apparently. And He's going to give you a boldness. He's going to give you a little bit of fire in your belly, a little bit of passion to go like, no, it's not okay for us to be depressed and anxious. It's not okay for us to be burned out. When I was feeling those things, I didn't have the words for it. But now on the other side, God's pulled me through it so that there's a lot of meaning attached to going like, I want my pain to become purpose. And God will always let our pain become purpose if we let it.
I want to just share, this is Rebekah's book, Building a Resilient Life. The fifth rule, I want you to conclude just sharing about the power of community. I mean, thinking about joining you guys today, your church, locally, the people that you're doing life with. It's impossible to build a life alone. You have to build a life with others. And I believe the church calls us to that. We hear about this concept, Paul writes about the household of faith. It wasn't just one nuclear family. It was people who were in community with one another, whether they were single, whether they were divorced, whether they'd walked through pain and were alone, or they'd lost a loved one. This household of faith did life together, and there's no way to be resilient unless we endure together. So talk about that vision.
Yes, absolutely. You cannot build a resilient life alone. We are a communal people made by a communal God. I love in Genesis 1, he says, let us, it's the Trinity talking to each other. They're saying, let us make man in our image, meaning that they wanted us to be a they. Does that make sense? Like, it's not just that Rebekah in isolation is going to actually name the pain or shift the narrative or embrace adversity or make meaning. No, it's with Gabe and with our kids and with our household of faith and our community. And I would say more than ever, in these last couple of years, I can jump on a plane and go teach somewhere and come home but that's not building a resilient life of witness with people that are seeing us in our everyday. They're seeing me look ridiculous and, barely getting my hair washed, or just, in the trenches, like we started gardening and we're taking care of chickens, and we've got neighbors that are kind of helping us because we don't know what we're doing. We used to live in New York. We are for sure amateurs. But just having people in our community, in our neighborhoods, in our churches, in our small groups, in our kids' friend groups, schools, all of a sudden going like, let's live on mission together. Let's push into places of pain. I'm in a group of 12 women every week. We open the scriptures, we read one chapter of the Bible, and inevitably, by the end, someone is crying about some burden that we're all coming around them, laying hands and asking God to get in and move and shift something. He really wants us to be the church, and the church is such a communal thing. Acts 2 was all about them breaking bread, being together in community. And when you are united in such a strong way like that, you start to do bigger things in your city. Gabe, describe some of the things that like God has used, just this decision to tether ourselves to one another. That what's that even look like that spills beyond just our family and our friendships?
Yeah, you start to build community and endure together by understanding you don't have to have it all figured out. So many times we feel pressure and we feel overwhelmed because we think we alone have to navigate the future. And that's not the case. God wants us to be in community with others who have different gifts, different talents, different resources. And in that beauty of the church, in that beauty of a community, you start to find a unique role that you might play. And so mine, in some cases with our community, is encouragement. It's leadership. It's trying to help people meet one another and know one another who have these different giftings. And we've started to see the beauty of that play out in our own town, right where we live.
That's looked like, people in just civil society, right? Like what's our role in the education system? Like, how do we actually, downtown on Main Street, how do businesses support one another? What does this look like in our churches? What does this look in healthcare? Like, there's so many giftings in the body. That's what's just so beautiful, that God gave us all these birthright gifts, and that when we deploy them with a sense of unity and purpose and mission, a shared mission, it's really joyful. It becomes really joyful. I mean, during COVID, just a group of people decided to put on a special needs prom because everything had shut down, and there was just no way for our kiddos like Kay to feel they didn't understand what was going on. And so this was a way to like normalize that. We had a wedding in our front yard because the venues shut down. We had like our kids like getting to know each other through Zoom, but then also having ways that they could connect. It just took some creativity, but I really think this enduring together, there's something we learned in these last couple of years that we're like, we don't want to lose that. God has really knit us in a way for things that we'll see today and things that we'll continue to see unfold as we move forward.
Yeah, so Rebekah and I are cheering you on. We love you guys. We're so grateful to have been a part of this morning and this conversation that you're having that's so important. And as you move into the summer, as you move into these coming months, may it be a time where you're able to really experience the flourishing and the fruitfulness that comes from a resilient life.